Today's theme, we're going to talk about the first thing that is oftentimes a part of the second half of life, and that is transition and the experience of letting go, choosing to choose to let go. And I want to begin tonight by unpacking a little bit where we left off last week, right? Number 5. The transition from the first half to the second half of life. Every beginning begins when something ending ends. The transition looks different for all of us. For some of us, it's a series of transitions. For some of us, it is an extended transition. For some of us, it looks very different. It's all going to look different for each of us. And even as we look at number 5 and kind of go back to where we ended last week, I would encourage you to think about you and about your own transition into the second half of life. I tell you what, Rudy, can you do me a favor? Can you grab me a couple chairs and just kind of put them in the back there? We have a wonderful opportunity tonight to welcome more guests who are with us. So praise the Lord. Okay, so as we just kind of continue there together, number 5, what does the transition, what could it look like for some of us? For some of us, maybe the transition was facilitated by midlife. We all have experienced that in a different way. For some of us, it was empty nest. Again, we laughed last week. For some of us, that transition was when the birds left the nest and you had to deal with life after that. For some of us, it's when you wanted the birds to leave the nest and they decided that they were going to stay and roost for a little while, right? Or they left and they came back, and they left and they came back, and that is filled with lots of different things. That's right. For some of us, the transition could be facilitated by divorce. Maybe there's a professional transition. I was telling the group this morning, I had a buddy of mine who graduated from LSU with his PhD in petroleum engineering, and he got a job immediately with Shell, and after many years with Shell, he just found out most recently that he was going to be losing his job because of everything going on in the economy, and he was being replaced with a cheaper 26-year-old who was coming out of college. And he was all mad because he says, those young guys don't know anything about the real world. And I said, just remember that you were once one of those guys who didn't know anything about the real world. And so he's still working professionally, but he's experiencing being replaced almost by someone who he doesn't have a lot of respect with. And it has elicited a lot of different emotions in his heart. He's struggling with that. So we can experience a transition emotionally that can kind of shine light on the first half and second half of life. Even if we don't lose our job or lose our profession, there can just be a shift in that altogether. For some of us, it's retirement. For some of it, it's your health, your spouse's health. I dare say using examples that get our attention, because I know it has touched a lot of us close to home, but cancer doesn't ask your permission. Diabetes doesn't ask your permission. Car accidents don't ask your permission, and those dramatic events in life can change life in a very dramatic way. It could be sobriety, as we celebrate our AA group just on the other side of the wall there. When you reach sobriety, or someone that you love that you've been living with reaches sobriety, it can change life in a very dramatic way. It could be death. It could be the death of your parents, or maybe your spouse, or someone close to you, or maybe there's something else, right? But the transition looks very particular for all of us. Again, for some of us, some of these things hit close to home, and for others of us, maybe it's something different. However, as something is ending, as we said last week, our freedom to embrace what's ending can often be facilitated in some of these things. So I just want to pause for a second. I just want you to look at that list of number 5. I'm not going to ask you to say anything. You don't have to share this with anybody, but just think in your own heart right now. When you think about some of the major transitions in your life, specifically maybe one that would have had a dramatic influence in your transition from the first half to the second half of life, do any of those words connect to your heart? Again, you don't have to say anything. just to kind of look in your own heart tonight. Now, what are some of the things that influence whether or not we're going to be free to embrace the transition? Let's look at number 6. Again, to the degree that we're free to embrace the transition influences how free we are to move forward after the transition. The first is preparation. Some of us were prepared for that type of transition, and maybe some of us were not prepared for that type of transition. Maybe it came earlier than you wanted it to, or maybe you were prepared to some degree, but you weren't prepared fully for it. Second bullet. This is a key one, I think. Expectations. We're going to circle back around this next week because there's a direct connection between unmet expectations and resentments. And letting go of resentments and forgiveness is a significant piece of the second half of life. But expectations influence our ability to embrace change. Was the transition in your life, or the way that the transition unfolded, in line with what you dreamed life was going to look like? Now, maybe that language doesn't connect with you. Maybe you had some dreams of life, or maybe you didn't. But many of us carry, whether we know it or not, this vision of what life is supposed to look like. We certainly have visions or expectations of what your spouse is supposed to act like, right? You probably do a good job of reminding him or her of that, right? But we often have our own vision, dream of what's fair and not fair in life, or what you expect or don't expect in life. Number 2, did people meet your expectations and the transition? Or did God meet your expectations in the transition? Let me give you 2 different examples of the transition and 2 different ways that we might experience that. I'll use one with maybe the emergence of grandchildren in your life, and the second will be the retirement, because those are 2 major life moments that often invite people from the first half of life to the second half of life. So let's first talk about grandchildren. I'll use an example that I know because I don't have my own grandchildren, but I've watched this unfold. My mom dreamed about grandchildren her whole life. My mom had a vision of what she thought life would be, and I'm fairly certain that her babies having their own babies was a big part of that. So, of course, I don't have any children. My middle brother, Philip, has not yet married, and so he doesn't have children. My oldest brother, PJ, has 1 child, and the circumstances of life kind of dictated that would only be 1 child. So my 3 sisters are the ones, as life has unfolded, who have had their own children, and of the 7 that we have, 6 of them belong to my sisters. And all 3 of them live out of state. Right? So here's the transition. There's a big transition in my mom's life, and it's called being a grandmother. And that was a dream of hers, right? Okay, so there's a transition there that did meet her expectation. But did the people in the transition meet her expectations, right? Now, she didn't expect her daughters to live in Houston or in Chicago or North Carolina. And there's no one at fault there. What I'm saying is that we can either embrace the moves and changes of life, or we can resist them. And sometimes we don't know why we're resisting the changes of life. And sometimes it is a beautiful thing, like grandbabies. But there can be unmet expectations because, for example, in my mom's life, those grandbabies don't live at home, right, where we can see them all the time. Let's talk a little bit about retirement. For many people, retirement is the thing that ushers them into the second half of life. And we all know people where in a married couple, let's say one of them retired first or one of them was at home first. And then the other person retired, right? And the other person is messing up their schedule, right? All right, they had their whole life figured out, and then he retired, right? Or she retired, or whatever it is, right? And so I often laugh with people as we talk about retired life, and it's like many people say, like, our marriage was much better when he was working, right? or she was working, or whatever it is, right? So we're both working, right? Right? So there can be this thing that you anticipate called retirement, right? But we didn't factor in maybe some of the ways that people would or would not meet our expectations in the transition. So those are some of the dynamics that are at play, and if we understand the dynamics, then we can appreciate how we can find God in the midst of all of that. Sometimes God doesn't meet our expectations. And so here you are, you're in a season of life where you've reached a lot of freedom, and do we have 2 chairs back there, Rudy, for our 2 friends? Okay. You've reached a season in life where things are going swimmingly according to plan, and then what happens is suffering happens, right? And maybe we asked God to do something, and God did not come through for us. Right? So we needed God to do something, and we can live with this resentment toward God. So just because the external circumstances maybe do or do not meet your vision in life, there can be all these other things that influence whether or not we can embrace the change. The first task of the second half of life is letting go. But we have to know what we're letting go of if we're going to feel free in the process, right? It's one thing having somebody take something away from you. It's another thing of voluntarily letting it go, right? It's hard to let go of something if you don't know why you're holding on to it. And that's hopefully some of the lights that being shined on here. So, again, don't say anything, but just look at that list for a second. Look at number 6. Think back to your transition, whether it was listed in number 5 or not. And think about your transition, and I want to lift up 3 words: preparation, expectations, and control. Which of those, if any of them, made it difficult in the transition, if you struggled in the transition at all? But just to think about those 3 words, just for a second. Okay, let's look at the top of page 3 together. So number 7, the first task of the second half of life is letting go. That's the invitation, and that's the first invitation because that's actually the invitation over and over and over in lots of different ways. Throughout the first half of life, the second half of life, we're letting go in lots of different ways. Number 8, the first place we let go is in our identity. And there are 2 faces of the false self from the first half of life. Number A, in the first half of life, we often, not everybody, but many of us, we project outward to other people the person we want to be, which is a sum of our success. Now, maybe you did this, maybe you didn't do this, maybe you were aware that you did it, maybe you were unaware that you did it. But in the first half of life, when you're younger, we try to put on an impression of who we are to the world. And of course, we don't air our dirty laundry to the world, right? We want the world to think that we are the sum of all of our success. Why is it that whenever somebody's coming to your house, you scramble to clean up the house, right? Especially around Thanksgiving or Christmas, like, right? Like people think we really live in that house the rest of the year, right? Okay, but we try to put on this air that everything's picked up, nice and neat, and this is how we are, right? Okay, so when you're younger, in the first half of life, many people, they put on an impression outwardly of who they are, and it's a sum of our success. That's a false self. And in the first half of life, what often builds up is another false identity that many of us struggle with interiorly, which is believing that we are a sum of our failure. So if on the outside, we're trying to add up all of our successes, for many people, the voice that they hear when they look at themselves on the inside is that they are a sum of our failure. So interiorly, we hear the whispers of all of our mistakes, right? We never hear the balance of, well, that was a sin, and you sinned. Rather, it accuses us of being a sinner, right? Or being the sin itself. So in the first half of life, these two false selves kind of build up in our life. Who we want the world to think we are, and who we fear ourselves to secretly be. Second bullet. That identity is influenced by those false selves, you might say those masks, or maybe for some of us, it's what or who others wanted you to be. Our parents have a big influence on us. Our parents may have wanted us to do this or that, to follow in the family business, or to be the mother or father that they always wanted to be, or maybe they wanted you to have the kids that they couldn't have, or whatever, right? So sometimes other people want us to be a certain way. It could be our spouse, it could be our kids or our family or whatever. Sometimes that false mask is driven by the way that we perceive other people want us to be. Letter B. Sometimes our false self is driven by what we don't want to be. How many times have I heard people say, like, I'm never going to be like my mother. I'm never going to be like my father. And then you turn out to be just like your mother and just like your father, right? But for a lot of us, our childhood can be filled with a lot of unmet expectations or pain or trauma, and we can react, right, to the home we grew up in, and like, I'm never going to be like that. And so we build up this false self driven by external factors of what we don't want to be. Letter C. Sometimes our false self is driven by who or what we perceive life requires us to be. Let me give you an example, and if the example hits close to home, just know it's really only an example. So it's just an example. So let's say you have a family of 10. Okay? Amen. That's right. Let's say you have a family of 10. And the oldest is a boy. And the daddy dies traumatically in an offshore accident. Well, at 16 years old, the oldest boy has to be what he perceived life requires. He's got to be the man of the family, right? Does that make sense? So sometimes the circumstances of life, we can perceive that life, I have to be this way, right? Again, if it hits close to home, it's just an example, but it's one of the things that I carry quietly as a priest, just in deep grief and intercession. When I'm around funerals and when I hear people say, I just have to be strong. And what I want to say is, no, you don't. You just have to be you. God's plenty strong. But circumstances happen in life, divorce, an unplanned pregnancy, lots of different things where people say, I have to be. Okay, all of those statements, what we call vows, I have to be, prevent me from being who I am. Because now I claim this identity, right? So in the first half of life, all this is happening, right? And then what happens is, then in the second half of life, you come face to face with the fact that a lot of those are just false. Look at the third bullet there. What is it that frees us from those false images in the second half of life? Well, sometimes the transition itself frees you from that, right? So let's say you have, I'll use two different examples. You have a man, and he is a provider. That's what he does. His whole life, he's been a provider. Let's just use, for the sake of the example tonight, the 16-year-old kid whose father dies, he's the first of 10, and he's going to provide for his family. And his whole life, he's been a provider. And then he retires. And now he's not providing anymore, right? Okay. Well, there's a beautiful, natural, expected, healthy tug of war now. Who am I that I'm not providing? Well, he comes face to face with, well, is that really the core of who I am? Right? So sometimes the transition itself kind of speaks to maybe that's not who you really are. Let's give you another transition that would mark the journey from the first half to the second half, and that's burying your mom or your dad. Now, for those of you who've done that, God bless you. I've done that in my own life, but Father Rolheiser himself says that you haven't started living until you've had to bury your parents, because it opens up something in your heart that you'll never close again. And for those of you who've been there, you know what that feels like. Again, fictitious example. Girl, never met her father's expectations, and she just never felt like she was good enough because of her dad. Her dad dies. She buries her father. And as she buries her father, she's feeling this transition, right? This major transition in life. And in that process, what she buries with her father is a lot of the anger at her dad. And she comes face to face with, I'm not dirty. I'm not good enough. Like, she comes face to face with the false self, right? So sometimes, that's what we're trying to say there, what frees us from the false self is actually the transition itself. Next one, letter B. Limitations, when we can no longer do and therefore be who we used to be, right? So in the second half of life, things don't work maybe as efficiently as they used to, right? And as we deal with our body in different ways, it in and of itself, our body image or the way that we thought about ourselves because of what we could do, just sometimes it's our health that kind of gets our attention of, well, who am I really if I'm not that? Letter C and D together. Confronting the sin and consequence of sin from the first half of life, or broken relationships from the first half of life. So let's say you have I'll give you two examples, a mother and a father. So you have a father who was just driven and hard the first half of life, and there's some wounded relationships with his children, and he comes into the second half of life, and life just seasons you a little bit, and you start to mellow, and he looks back on these broken relationships, and he starts to ask himself, well, why are those broken? Well, why was I so driven? You see, it's the relationships that get our attention, and if we let them, they can actually reveal the masks that we wore in the first half of life that drove us so hard. Letter E. Sometimes what frees us from a false image is forgiving others and embracing their weakness helps us to, in the same way, embrace our weakness. In the second half of life, as we'll talk about next week, forgiving, letting go of resentments is a huge thing. We'll talk about this a little later tonight, but let's say that there's a person in your life, whoever they are. I'm not saying that there is anybody, but if there's a person in your life, and you have just struggled for your entire life with this person. In the second half of life, you just reach a point in life where you're like, you forgive them. What a lot of times happens is this. When we struggle in relationships with people that are close to us, we project onto them all of our disappointments, and we wanted them to be a certain way and they disappointed us, so we have these resentments, right? So when I forgive them and I give them permission to be human, guess what happens? Well, now I give myself permission to be human, right? So they're imperfect and they're weak, and that's okay, I can forgive them. But that means also now I'm looking in the mirror and like, okay, I can be forgiven too. We'll talk about this next week. It's a big thing. You can't forgive a category. You can only forgive people. we all have categories, some graphic ones that he's a, you fill in the blank, right? Or she's a, right? Well, I can't forgive that. But if well, he drank, and that's why he was angry, and that's why he did that. And the reason he drank was because he was hurting, and there was a lot of pain there, right? I can forgive that. But I can't forgive the category, right? That's part of the second half of life is people become human, and we become human all over again. Number 9, if the first thing that we do is let go of our identity, all right, the false self, the second thing that's a part of the second half of life, the work that we're in together, is learning how to let go of relationships. This is a key thing, right? We can resist letting go. First bullet. Being forced to let go of relationships can be the classroom that teaches us how to let go of many other things. And sometimes we let go of relationships on our own. So, and the first half of life, we feel a burden of expectations, and maybe you just choose out of the freedom of your own heart, you know what, I'm going to walk away from a relationship because it's not healthy for either of us. And as you walk away, you're like, I feel better, right? I begin to let go of the things that hold me bound. However, third bullet, sometimes life does not ask your permission. And sometimes you're forced to let go. For example, through death. When death doesn't ask our permission. Nobody asks you, is it okay if I take your mom or your dad? Nobody asks you permission, is it okay if I take your spouse? So death, and when those relationships are physically no longer there, there's something about suffering, and specifically suffering the loss of relationships, that teaches us the reality of what the rest of our lives will be, which is letting go. So it's not that the second half of life is letting go of relationships, but nothing more powerfully teaches us about freedom than death itself, right? So it's the letting go of relationships that is the classroom that teaches us about freedom. Death forces you to look inside your heart, and it teaches us how to let go. Now, that's where some of the battles with God can be. That's where some of the battles with ourself can be. When death takes a loved one without your permission, there may be a conversation that you never got to have with that person on earth. I was never able to forgive my dad on earth, so now I've got to do it at the cemetery, right? Or things like that. So all that is a part of it, but it's the classroom that gets your attention in life and teaches you how to let go. Number 10, and that touches on control. First bullet, letting go in those essential relationships, marriage, grandchildren, children, it reminds us that we are not in control. And if there's one thing that is a part of the first half of life, it is the illusion of being in control. It's often the wreckage that comes when we live our lives in control, and all the interior unfreedom that comes because we think we can control life. In the second half of life, we're just confronted over and over and over that we're not in control, and nothing gets your attention more than death. You can't control it. Letter B. In the second half of life, if you haven't learned it yet, you come face to face, you realize that you cannot control other people. And this is often in the classroom of suffering. So for those of you who have children, I can only lift up what my heart senses. You know this much more personally. But it's one thing for you to suffer. It's another thing for you to see your kids suffer. Huh? Boy, that's a different kind of pain that I don't know. I can love you in it. And when you see your children or any loved one making decisions in their life that you can't stop, it just reminds you that we're not in control of anything. We're not in control of our health. We can't control death. We can't control this person from drinking or spending or doing what they're going to do, or I told them not to marry him or her or move there or get that job or do this with their kids. And sometimes it's the people that we love the most in the second half of life that it almost feels like we're being stripped of lots of control, which is a liberating thing if we can understand how God is in the midst of it all, which we'll talk about in a couple of seconds. Third bullet, the longing for closure. One of the things that's outside of our control is our ability to have closure with certain circumstances. If a relationship breaks off and you didn't ask for it to break off, or if you didn't get to say what you wanted to say before somebody died, or you didn't get to do this last thing at this moment of life, a lot of people are looking for closure in lots of different ways. There can be a lot of energy that we expend in life trying to get closure. And when we don't have closure, it's not that a window's open, but there's a lot of energy that it takes to try to keep something open or to try to close it. And closure can be something that confronts our inability to be in control. And then finally, number 11, not that it's a big thing, but just to show you it's a fruit. So if all that's there, we're letting go of our false self and we're letting go of control, then it wouldn't surprise us that many people downsize in the second half of life, right? Because you don't need all that stuff anymore, right? Right? First bullet, right? Our possessions are merely possessions until they possess us, right? In the first half of life, our possessions often possess us. Well, that's how a lot of people feel, right? The question in the first half is not what I have, but why do I have that? Or why do I need that, right? You know, so you were 45 and you went through midlife crisis and you bought a Harley, right? Why do you need the Harley, right? And you went through midlife crisis and you bought a boat. You don't know how to drive a boat, but you bought a boat, right? Or you went shopping, or you did this, or whatever, right? Right. So possessions are often driven by identity. So just to kind of connect a dot, a real simple dot for you tonight, that as we let go of our false self, that's why there's often an easy transition with financial or physical possessions in the second half. So before you flip a page, I just want you to look up there. When you look at those three things, number 8, number 9, or number 10, what most speaks to your heart tonight? Again, you don't have to say anything, but just look at your own heart, your own life tonight. Freedom in life comes when we know where to enter into the conversation with the Lord. And as Rudy was sharing with us, there can be great joy. That's what the second half of life is really all about. It's about joy. It's about freedom. But we got to walk down that path with the Lord in order to experience the freedom. And sometimes if we're going to walk to the freedom, we have to walk through either our need to be in control, or our loss of control, or the school of suffering with relationships, or the shedding of the false identity. So the spirituality of the second half of life, right? That's what this class is all about, right? Well, sometimes you got to know what to talk to the Lord about. It's one thing, as a parent, for example, to spend lots of your time in the second half of life praying for your kids. Keep doing that. It's another thing to talk to the Lord about the pain in your heart, about why you have to do that. Do you see the difference between the two? That's where the spirituality of the second half of life comes. That's just an example. Keep praying for your kids, right? But the Lord wants to talk to you about you and any pain that might be there about your kids. Or pray for the world. Well, how do you feel about the way the world's going? Right? So we have to know what to talk to the Lord about in our relationship with Him. There's a great line in the in the Catechism, in the 4th section when it talks about prayer, and it says this. It says, if our heart is not connected to God in prayer, the words of prayer are in vain. I'm going to be very reverent as I say that. Okay, I'm going to say that again. But if we're not talking to the Lord about our heart, the Catechism, not for the mark, Catechism says that the words of prayer are in vain. So I love devotions. I love the rosary. I pray one every night. I've prayed one every night my whole life, I think. But at some point, those words that we're saying to the Lord need to be about us and our hearts. And this is where we're going to find the Lord, right? Tough part about the second half of life is you can't come out on the other end in freedom unless we go through a lot of the stuff that gets drummed up with everything we talked about tonight. I'll close with this on the top of page 4, number 12. The more that we start digging around our heart, we'll find other things that are there. And it's one thing to let go of relationships of the past. It's another thing to come face to face with just how many resentments have built up in our life. I haven't met a human being yet on the planet who doesn't have a whole lot of little bitty built up resentments from life. And what happens is the freedom in life comes not just in some of the stuff we talked about, but next we will talk about we are as free as our resentments. When we can forgive people, from all the way back in our childhood, all the way up to where we are. Forgiveness is the catalyst to freedom. Whether it's forgiving ourselves or people or God or whatever, forgiveness is a huge part. So if the first task of the second half of life is letting go, you might say the second task of the second half of life is forgiving. And that's where we're going to go next week together.